Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel Vichy. Do you remember the story about the boy, a literary character, who became famous for trolling his fellow villagers? He really enjoyed scaring them and then watching their reaction. This boy, being a shepherd, would run into the village shouting, "Wolves! Wolves!" And of course, fearing for the fate of their sheep, the villagers would rush to save the flock. Naturally, they would find no wolves there, and the boy would have great fun about it. And one day, when wolves really attacked the flock, no one believed the boy anymore, and the entire herd was slaughtered to the last sheep. What am I leading this to? For several years now, we have almost daily been hearing voices claiming that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being persecuted. And every time, it turned out that the UOC hierarchs who made such statements were like that very boy, whose words should be taken with doubt and verified many times over. And the strangest thing in our story today is that now this boy is silent, and the wolves have actually come. So, the topic of today's program is the persecution of priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Our guest on Vichy today is the mother of a priest who was forcibly pressured to join another jurisdiction. And because he wanted to remain faithful to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, he was sentenced to 14 years and sent to a strict regime colony. Mrs. Svitlana, welcome. Good afternoon. Also joining us today is a priest of the UOC, volunteer and non-staff chaplain, Father Volodymyr Kovalchuk. Father, good afternoon. Greetings to everyone. Good afternoon. So, let's begin our conversation. Svitlana Pavlivna, in February 2022, the city of Tokmak, Zaporizhia region, where your son, priest of the UOC, Kostiantyn Maksimov, lived and served in the local church, was occupied by Russian troops. Please briefly tell the story of your son, what happened next, and how he was sentenced. I will show a photo of my son. This is how he used to be, and this is how he is now. Yes, we can see. Thank you. Before the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, my son carried out his pastoral ministry in the city of Tokmak, Zaporizhia region, in the Church of the Dormition of the Holy Mother of God. But when the war began, on February 26th, Tokmak was already occupied. Russian troops entered and established their own rule there. They were forcing the residents to take Russian passports. And they also forced all priests to sign documents about joining the Russian Orthodox Church. But my son did not agree to these conditions. And during every pastoral service, he prayed for victory, for Ukraine, for the entire Ukrainian people. He brought such patriotic words to the people. He also did not commemorate the Patriarch of the Russian Church, Kirill, for which he was repeatedly placed into the so-called pit in the city of Tokmak. I found this out later. He never told me himself, probably to spare me. I heard it from the townspeople. He was under very strong moral and psychological pressure, and there were even threats to his life. So he was forced to leave the occupied Tokmak. On May 16, 2023, he left for Ukraine through Crimea. On that same day, at the Chonhar checkpoint, he was detained. There were no calls from him afterwards. When I tried to phone him, there was no connection at all. I appealed to all Russian authorities and institutions to find out where my son was. But they told me they didn't know where he was, and that such a person did not exist, neither in the occupied territories nor in Russia. 9 months of waiting, 9 months of searching, all in vain. And one day, after that period, I received a very small note from my son. He wrote, "Mom, I'm alive. Only an exchange can save me. Take care of yourself. I'm being tried under Article 276. All this time he was in the city of Melitopol, very close. While they were lying to me that he wasn't in the occupied territories, he was kept in basements, where he was abused and humiliated, and so on. Later, he was officially transferred to the city of Simferopol, Remand Center number 2, where, through a lawyer, I was somehow able to communicate with him, through small notes, and even send him parcels. There he awaited trial, which took place on August 2nd, 2024. He was sentenced to 14 years in a strict regime colony under Article 276. Now my son is in the city of Saratov, correctional colony, where he is serving his sentence. Recently, social media spread your public appeal asking everyone who can to help free your son from Russian captivity. On November 2024, almost a year ago, your son personally sent a letter to his Beatitude Metropolitan Onufrius, as to his father and primate, with a similar request, quote, "I humbly ask you to have intercession for my exchange as a civilian captive and political prisoner." Svitlana Pavlovna, during this year, have any representatives of the Kiev Metropolia of the UOC contacted you? Maybe some of the bishops privately offered you any help or support? Did anyone from the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church respond at all to your son's appeal? I understood the question. No, no one reacted. Earlier, when I still had the phone numbers, I called the Metropolia, and they told me that I needed to wait for the decision of Metropolitan Onufrius. But I never received any answer. Later, I couldn't reach the Metropolia at all. Their phone numbers were changed. I tried to find out the new numbers of the Metropolia, but no one gave them to me. I don't know why this is such a secret. I needed those numbers for further communication, and so no one contacted me. The only thing I can say is that they helped, when my son was transferred to the remand center in Simferopol to send him a parcel. But good people. What, are we going to send parcels to prison for 14 years and do nothing more? We have to get him out. Otherwise, there is complete silence. But I want to say that this silence from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does not kill me at all. On the contrary, it gives me strength to fight for my son's release. And I believe that everything will be fine. Because he lives with God in his soul. He lives with prayer. He will endure everything. And we will wait for him. And I hope that in your video program, there will later be a personal conversation and interview with him. We will definitely wait. But it hurts me very much, because maybe they are doing something there, but no one tells me anything about it. I believe that we must work together, and they should at least report to me what they have done, so that we move somehow in one direction. And so, for now, I repeat, only silence. Svitlana Pavlovna, today in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is commonly regarded as being part of the Moscow Patriarchate. But your son, even under pressure, never mentioned Patriarch Kirill in prayer, and publicly, categorically refused to join the Russian Orthodox Church. What motivated Father Kostiantyn? After all, this position did not not correspond to the circumstances he found himself in, the occupation, and it was obvious that such actions would lead to punishment. Did you discuss this issue with your son while you were still in contact with him? Why didn't Father Kostiantyn just stay silent? Why did he risk his own safety? You know, I've been asked this question more than once, by friends and by ordinary people. They said he could have just kept quiet, sat there, and everything would have been fine. But I want to say, nothing would have been fine. You can't live against your conscience, against the truth in your soul. That's why my son carried this truth into life. He simply couldn't act otherwise. He just couldn't. Because he felt a duty to his flock. He knew where the truth was and where the lie was. And that's why it happened the way it did. Svitlana Pavlovna, thank you so much for your son and for how you raised him. I know that you've engaged a very professional and strong lawyer. Father Kostiantyn's defense is being led by Yulia Bohdan, a well-known human rights defender and candidate of juridical sciences, whom we will also see in today's program. Dear friends, as Christians, we know how powerful prayer is. So I ask all our viewers to pray for the release of Father Kostiantyn from Russian captivity. And also, dear friends, if you have the possibility, please support Father Kostiantyn financially, because, as you understand, in a Russian prison, money decides many things. You can find the card number in the description of this program. Once again, thank you, Svitlana Pavlovna, and I truly wish that you may embrace your son again very soon. Goodbye. Thank you. Father, now a question to you. I understand that you cannot answer for the actions of the episcopate. That's obvious. But as a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, can you assume why it happened that literally just a few days after the Russian Orthodox Church retired Metropolitan Ilarion of Donetsk and Mariupol and appointed a new one, we immediately heard more than 30 hierarchs of the UOC express their disagreement with the actions of the Russian Orthodox Church in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and at the same time, for over a year now, a priest of the UOC has been held in the dungeons of a Russian penal colony, having gone through torture, humiliation, and beatings, only because he wanted to remain faithful to the UOC. Yet from those same hierarchs, we hear a dead silence. Allow me to wish Father Kostiantyn's mother patience and great hope. Returning to your question, I would say that it's not only Metropolitan Ilarion who is now being talked about. There is also Metropolitan Arseny, Metropolitan Feodosy of Cherkasy, and so on. These are metropolitans. They are hierarchs of the church. That's why people are talking about them. Unfortunately, I have to say that priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have no rights. They only have duties. And somehow, it has happened in our church that a bishop is like a general. There are many priests, but not so many bishops. In our administrative statute, it is clearly written that bishops have rights. They have pensions, they have provisions, but the rights of priests are not mentioned there at all. So even from this alone, we can say that priests are treated as secondary, unimportant. And as for why this situation with Father Kostiantyn happened, I don't fully understand, because there have been prisoner exchanges. The press service of Metropolitan Onufrius repeatedly publicized that exchanges of priests and soldiers from the occupied territories had taken place, because, as we know, the war has been going on since 2014 to 2015. So the situation is unclear. Perhaps there will be some kind of pseudo-diplomatic excuses, like the diocese should be dealing with this, because every diocese has its own bishop and functions like a small church. So they might say that the corresponding diocese, I understand it would be the Berdyansk diocese, should have taken some action. But there has been no action. we might assume that some rumors, that he was allegedly an informant for the security service of Ukraine, played a role, and that's why the Church supposedly doesn't want to get involved in his case. But he is not a combatant. Whatever the Russian courts falsify, under the Geneva Convention, he is not a combatant.
Therefore, the Church is obliged not just to exchange its priests, but to do everything possible to save them.
Why is that not happening? I'll repeat again. Probably because today's bishops who run our church simply don't have the time. Because, as they say, we are being persecuted. Although, in fact, real persecution happens when people are forced to renounce their faith, to deny Jesus Christ. But today in Ukraine, no one is forcing anyone to deny Jesus Christ. So, for me as a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and I've been in the church since 1986, it's hard to understand what kind of persecution we are supposedly facing. There is none.
And if we look at what's happening now with the bishops I mentioned earlier, then we must also talk about the priests.
Many of our priests are dying at the front. Many are being mobilized into the armed forces of Ukraine, even though they cannot hold weapons in their hands. This also needs to be discussed, because our dioceses, by failing to comply with state requirements, are not protecting priests today. So, the situation with this particular Christian is a terrible one. Perhaps his mother is listening now, and it might be inappropriate for me to say this, but I will say it. I have very, very little hope that the governing body of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will help her in this matter.
And maybe tomorrow I'll get a phone call and be reprimanded. You're criticizing your own church, and so on. That's how it always happens with us.
They'll say, we were carrying out some special operation, secretly. We were doing something confidential, and with your appearance on the Viche channel, you ruined everything. It's your fault. That could happen tomorrow, immediately. That's their excuse. I'm predicting it in advance. But as for whether the governing body of our church, the UOC, will actually do something, I have very, very little hope.
Because, as the history of our church shows, a priest is treated as a kind of secondary element.
Especially now, during this war, in the current political situation. No one in the church leadership really cares that somewhere, some priest is suffering. That's how I interpret it, based on my experience in the church. They'll say, we have our own problems. So, unfortunately, very unfortunately, I have little hope.
Father, I'd like to say that, in principle, it would be pure manipulation if someone says, well, you raised this issue, and that's why everything fell apart. Because, in fact, we wouldn't even be discussing this problem if someone from the church leadership had reached out to the mother, or if she had any contact with them at all. We've just heard her say that during all this time, there hasn't been a single response. They didn't even give her the contacts of the Metropolitanate. I am sure that if someone had simply told her, this information is not for public disclosure, but please know that we are working on the issue of his release, she would definitely not have turned to the public asking for help in saving Father Kostiantyn's life. Dear viewers, as you can see, joining us now is Mr. Vladyslav Havrylov, a visiting researcher at Georgetown University, USA, analyst at the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and advisor on the investigation of crimes against children.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Mr. Vladyslav has been with us on the line for some time already, so he's aware of the topic of our discussion and has heard what we've been talking about. Friends, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke with Father Kostiantyn's lawyer, Miss Yulia Bohdan. Let's now watch a short video where we asked Miss Yulia, what stage is Father Kostiantyn Maksimov's case right now?
The story of Kostiantyn Maksimov is clear evidence of war crimes committed by the Russian Federation and violations of a whole range of norms of international humanitarian law.
As of today, Kostiantyn Maksimov is being held in the Saratov region and has been unlawfully sentenced to 14 years in a high-security penal colony. Mr. Vladyslav, Ms. Yulia mentioned in our phone conversation that, even though Father Kostiantyn is already included on the list for exchange, it's too early to relax. Because the Russian side often follows a strange practice. They sign 100 people for exchange, but release only 2.
We understand the real value of such agreements with that side. But for our people in captivity, even these meaningless agreements sometimes become their last hope.
From your own experience and that of the organization you represent, what leverage can be used to influence the Russian side? What actually affects their decisions? First of all, I agree with Ms. Yulia that the Russian Federation indeed violates international humanitarian law. And I'd like to briefly summarize what my colleagues have been researching. At present, there are at least 3,604 known cases of enforced disappearances of civilians detained in the occupied territories. In other words, just like Father Kostiantyn, these are civilians who have been unlawfully detained. You can see the scale of this phenomenon.
As for civilians detained in the Russian Federation itself, according to our organization's data, there are 297 cases known to us, with 179 sentences already issued. And in the occupied territories of Ukraine, 326 cases and 187 sentences. Most of these sentences accuse people of extremism or attempts to overthrow the government. To make you understand the cynicism of these crimes, they classify such cases on the occupied territories as if those were Russian territories, and they accuse Ukrainian citizens of violating Russian law, or the laws of the so-called occupied territories. It sounds horrifying, but that is the reality. Now, regarding possible levers of influence, I would say, and this is important, that there are not many mechanisms for returning civilians from those places of detention where they are currently held. And I believe the participation of hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church could and should play a very important role here. Obviously, in those remand centers and men's penal colonies where our civilian detainees are held, there are prison chaplains. But we know that these chaplains of the Russian Orthodox Church not only fail to help our detainees, they actually cooperate and collaborate with the Federal Penitentiary Service of the Russian Federation, which commits numerous crimes against them. It would be very helpful, for instance, if Metropolitan Onufrius or Metropolitan Antony would reach out to Metropolitan Mercury of Rostov or Metropolitan Zinovy of Mordovia. Why am I naming these people? Because they are the ruling hierarchs of those dioceses whose territory includes the detention centers, and they could actually visit those places and conduct a monitoring mission to see what is happening there. After all, we know from testimonies of former prisoners, both soldiers and civilians who have returned from captivity, that they have endured horrific torture and abuse. Unfortunately, such a threat may also hang over Father Kostiantyn and many others who remain in those detention centers. And we see absolutely no progress from the episcopate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to help or intervene in any way. And that, honestly, is very sad. Look, in order not to speak without evidence, I also addressed this question to the lawyer, Ms. Yulia. And I had the question, what role does the Church, and in particular the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, play in the case of Father Kostiantyn Maksimov? Is there any care or support from the Church, to which Father Kostiantyn was sentenced essentially for his fidelity and devotion? Together with Father Kostiantyn's mother, we sent requests to many religious organizations, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Holy See. However, no response was provided. But we do not lose hope and continue the fight. Civilians who are in captivity should be released unconditionally and without exchange. Father, recently a video was released in which Metropolitan Onufry addressed the flock with a call for love and mutual assistance. And we agree with him. We need to help each other. But how can the faithful appeal to his beatitude with the same call to help their spiritual children who are now in captivity in the Russian Federation? Because for Metropolitan Onufry, after all, it would not require titanic efforts just to write a letter to Patriarch Kirill and advocate for this particular priest and thousands of other fellow citizens who found themselves in the jaws of this unjust aggressor war.
I will also add that before the full-scale war, many billboards were put up in the Kiev region, where a quote of Metropolitan Onufry was written, "Seek the truth first." Much was said about the truth there. In reality, this is a policy of silence, a sort of rural, primitive policy, which, unfortunately, will continue under Primate Metropolitan Onufry. Why is this happening? Perhaps because he is a poorly educated person. This is evident in his messages, which he writes with orthographic, syntactic errors, and so on. Perhaps his cautious position is, "My house is at the edge, I know nothing," or to hide in some kind of hiding place. Perhaps this happens psychologically, because I do not understand. Mr. Vladyslav mentioned that bishops should act. But why not the priests? There are about 10,000 priests.
This is our brother in Christ. Why don't we gather today and sign an appeal? We always love to collect signatures. We had signatories. We have a brotherhood. Why don't we gather today and send our signatures to our ruling bishops or Metropolitan Onufry for our brother, Father Kostiantyn, so that our bishops, as you said, would act, because they are the administrative center and they are supposed to do this. I repeat again, I have very little hope that this will happen. There will be many manipulations, many excuses. Perhaps the impetus will be this program, and eventually they will do something. Call the Russian bishops, because we all understand that contacts exist. We cannot prove this, but we understand that there are some messages, some contact persons, through whom this issue can be resolved. And there are levers for this. And there were such examples before, because there were exchanges. But I repeat again, I do not fully understand why this was not done. Perhaps there are some hidden currents that will become known to us tomorrow, but probably these are justified manipulations. However, I repeat once again, this must be done not only by the bishops, but also by us, as priests, because this is our brother. By the way, he is one of the few who today suffers daily for all priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the occupied territories. And as I understand it, he has now been transferred to a colony deep within the territory of Russia. That is exactly the point. You see, Father, you speak about why no one from the church reached out to free the priest. I am also surprised precisely by that fact, because we see other appeals regarding so-called imprisoned bishops, here on the territory of Ukraine, or those who are under investigation for justifying the war. Even when there is actually no serious threat to a bishop, we immediately see how Orthodox media close to the Metropolitanate begin to cover that topic speculatively and manipulatively. But here is a concrete situation, a real danger to life. Everything is documented, and complete silence. This, without doubt, cannot be left as it is. Even from a moral point of view, we do not have the right to do so. I will now ask to show another video quote from Miss Yulia. Russian troops in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine are deliberately persecuting clergymen who actively opposed cooperation with the occupiers. Repressions similar to those in Soviet times have returned to the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by Russia. In addition, the occupation authorities systematically blackmail clergymen and their faithful, forcing them to cooperate and to accept the ideology of the Ruski Mir, in particular, to recognize the Russian Church. This is exactly what I am talking about. If only there had been at least some note of protest from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I will add that from a personal conversation with Miss Yulia, I learned an interesting fact. In reality, the only means of communication with the Russian human rights system are the so-called good Russians,
Many of them have the status of foreign agents, and sometimes are the last possibility of contact both with prisoners and with the human rights, judicial, and penitentiary system of the Russian Federation itself. In our Ukrainian environment, the theme of good Russians has become wearisome. There are moments when one does not want to hear about good or bad Russians anymore, and that is true. On the other hand, the depersonalization and dehumanization of the enemy may lead to us finally becoming its mirror image. And, strangely enough, this medal has a third side. Recently, Vladimir Putin, as president of the Russian Federation, signed a law on withdrawal from the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And what other dehumanization of the enemy can be discussed if that same enemy, at the level of its president, dehumanizes its entire enormous country, where now, on a legislative level, it is absolutely normal to mock, torture, humiliate, rape, and so on. Mr. Vladyslav, according to your information, what number of Ukrainian prisoners are currently held in the dungeons, basements, and pits of the Russian Federation? And how many of our children have been kidnapped and forcibly taken there? And what instruments does civilized society, and the Church ultimately, have to at least somehow influence this lawlessness?
First of all, I will speak perhaps about terrible things, but this needs to be said, which are the consequences of leaving the Convention Against Torture, and what kind of torture we are actually talking about. In Russian detention facilities, in remand centers, in male colonies in particular, there is a procedure upon arrival, both for prisoners of war and civilian detainees. They are forced out of the paddy wagon, beaten with stun guns, with rubber truncheons. Dogs are set on them. Afterwards, when they are already in prison, there are constant conveyor belt interrogations in the Soviet style. They are asked the same questions multiple times. Crimes are attributed to them, and attempts are made to impose a certain crime on the person. In addition, there are constant night inspections so that prisoners cannot sleep. This has been reported to us by those freed from captivity. They are constantly forced to squat hundreds of times, sing the Russian national anthem, sing Soviet songs. All of this is broadcast almost around the clock through audio speakers. That is, there is total psychological and physical pressure.
And what I also want to lead to, there are prison priests of the Russian Orthodox Church who come and celebrate the Divine Liturgy in the prison chapel. It is clear that they could see, or if not see, at least ask about the possibility of meeting with these civilian prisoners and prisoners of war. And the effects on people are even physically visible. We see how our boys and girls return. They lose 40 to 50 kilograms in weight. Some do not even speak. That is, years and years of rehabilitation will unfortunately be required for some. But the Russian Church part remains silent in this regard. At the same time, we do not see any initiative from the priests, as Father Volodymyr said, or from the bishops to raise this problem. And at least, starting with the example of Father Kostiantyn, to give an active church voice that does not legitimize the crime, but on the contrary exposes it and says it must be prevented.
If we speak about children, this is also a very complex story. From identified data, we know about 19,546 children, of whom only 1,605 have been identified and returned. But various international researchers say that there may be tens of thousands. For example, Yale University claims that 35,000 children were kidnapped from the occupied territories, and other researchers speak even of hundreds of thousands of children.
It must be understood that the kidnapping of children does not stop there. Further, the Russian authorities continue the Russification and militarization of these children. And here, I would also like to point out an interesting and tragic moment. We know about a children's recreational home in the Rostov region called Romashka. Children from the occupied Donetsk region were brought to this home, and many times the Metropolitan of Rostov, Mercury, visited it. That is, he is a bishop. He understands that these are children kidnapped from Ukrainian territory. He does not question what they are doing here, why they have not been returned home all these years. In fact, he legitimizes this crime, that it is good that these children are in Russia and should remain here. On the other hand, this news is publicly available. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in particular the episcopal body of this church, also does not react to these cases.
And I must also say, concluding this section, that these are not isolated cases. We know of the Marfo-Marinsky Monastery in the Belgorod Diocese, where Ukrainian children were also brought at the end of 2022. We know that children were taken to Tatarstan, to the Far East. In many places, there were meetings with official Russian officials, governors, and also with the Russian episcopate. And there is no strategic or systematic reaction from the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to all this.
Father Volodymyr, what do you think? Maybe this silence is actually a desire not to do harm? There is little hope for this. Of course, we always hope that this is a manifestation of reason, restraint, wisdom for the sake of results. I am a connoisseur of results. In Ukraine, we have a nice slang word, trindity, flapping gums. And in our church, unfortunately, we quite often engage in flapping gums. But actual matters. What can we really do? Mr. Vladyslav just spoke about the traditions of Janissary-like practice, so to speak the devshirma system, which has reappeared in Russia, as in imperial times. Child abduction by the occupying power. This is horrifying. What can we do in this situation? Using the example of Father Kostiantyn, I already said what we can do. In my opinion, engage each diocese to write appeals, serve molebens, prayers for the liberation of Father Kostiantyn, dedicate special liturgies, and constantly return to this issue. As for our children who were taken, this is Janissary practice, devshirma system, in the 21st century. It is horrifying. We all understand that these are fragile, not fully formed children in terms of civic and cultural identity. So they will grow up as Russians. They are forcibly Russified. What does this mean for us? We are losing our citizens, Ukrainians. Excuse me, I will add facts I recently learned. And these are very frightening facts. Very often these children are even given new names. That is, not only is their Ukrainian cultural identity changed, but also their personalities and passport data. And this affects the possibility in the future of finding relatives in Ukraine who remain on our territory. These children are given new first and last names. Yes, it is a terrible situation. Mr. Vladyslav spoke about the possibilities of priests. I also have a small hope for priests of the Russian Orthodox Church. Mr. Vladyslav, as an expert, knows that in Ukraine, parishes are governed by the community, and the priest is part of the community. But in Russia, Orthodox churches belong to the dioceses, meaning the administrator of any church is a bishop. Much depends on the bishop, but there, the bishops only say what Patriarch Kirill orders. Therefore, hope in the prison priests, of whom there are many, even in the so-called red zone, that they will do something for imprisoned priests from Ukraine is rather small. One can appeal to them, but if you realistically look at these cases, I view this skeptically, unfortunately. They can only make the situation of our prisoners worse. This is my opinion. Of course, we are not in those realities. We do not know how we would behave in Father Konstantin's situation. It is easy to speak when we are in a warm, safe place and reflect on this. But I sit here and think intensely. What can we actually do? Not just discuss this, but what can we really do to help? Informationally, we give publicity. But what should our church, our community, actually do? Most importantly, what has it done so far? I will speak for myself. I have spread information on Facebook, supported, liked posts about Father Konstantin, but this is very little. What concrete actions can be taken in this situation? After all, this situation could happen again to someone else, and most likely it will. And the same applies to priests of other Ukrainian churches and faiths, not only Orthodox. How can this be prevented? I do not know. Some small steps. Perhaps this program will awaken our church leadership a little, and they will respond, even if negatively. Or perhaps they will begin to act in this matter. Perhaps some work is already underway. We will see. Let us watch. Perhaps we can return to this program format in a month to see what has changed in this topic. Once we take on this matter, it must be carried through to the end. I agree with you that we must constantly return to this topic. And as I stated at the beginning of the broadcast, I will also ask at the conclusion, dear friends, both prayer and financial support for the mother are needed. Join in if you can. These are effective tools that each of us can use while in relative safety. Because in reality, in Ukraine, everyone is also in danger. But compared to what Father Konstantin endures daily, so prayer, money, pressure on bishops, constant return to the topic. This is what we can effectively do today. You remember how I began our program, with the story of a little shepherd boy, sheep, and villagers. I think that if we transfer this metaphor to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the picture is quite unattractive. The same little boy, in the person of our episcopate, for some reason frightens the villagers, in the person of our people, with wolves, presumably in the person of the state authorities, which in fact do not exist. And at the same time, he completely ignores the very real wolf pack, which at that moment is tearing the sheep apart in the temporarily occupied territories. Today already occupies and renames the Ukrainian Orthodox Church across entire dioceses, and does not hide its desire to destroy the UOC as such. And in conclusion, I have a question for both guests. Why do the voices of so-called human rights defenders, UOC lawyers, UN representatives, for example, Bishop Feodosi was going to go there, presumably to testify against the Ukrainian authorities regarding persecution of the church, resound worldwide, while the real medieval persecutions, where people are killed, tortured, and imprisoned for their loyalty to their church, are silenced and not even considered in principle? Mr. Vladyslav, the floor is yours. First of all, we must understand that in the occupied territories, when the Russian occupation administration arrives, a complete monopoly of the Russian Orthodox Church is established. And this concerns all churches that previously operated in the non-occupied territories. That is, persecution and oppression occur also against Protestant communities. Persecution occurs against the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which has been completely banned at the legislative level by the occupation administration. Persecution also occurs against the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the occupied territories. I would like to give an example here. There was an interview with Father Alexander Bohomaz, a priest of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church from Melitopol, who told me that he was told, "The only alternative to continuing your ministry here can only be to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church." Another practice. We see that when the Russian authorities enter and occupy certain territories, they automatically transfer the UOC diocese to the ROC. They do not ask for any permission from Metropolitan Onufry about this. We see this example in the Berdyansk diocese, which was transferred to the ROC. There are many such practices. Here, one can only grasp the scale of this persecution by the Russian authorities in the occupied territories.
Thank you for your answer. And Father, I will ask you to comment. Why do you think all of this is still being silenced? And what should be done?
I want to make a remark to Mr. Vladyslav. Unfortunately, you know, such totalitarian tendencies exist even in Ukraine because, for example, I cannot be an official chaplain, and in order for me to become an official chaplain, I would voluntarily, forcibly, have to transfer to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Isn't this similar to the situation of the Greek Catholic priest in Russia?
So we also need to solve such a problem. Returning to the situation of Father Kostiantyn and the occupied dioceses. From the leadership of our church, I do not see a clear, effective reaction or condemnation regarding our dioceses in Crimea and in other eastern dioceses, which today are effectively in the hands of the Russian Orthodox Church. I have not seen such a reaction. I see a reaction when one of our UOC priests serves with a clergyman of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Then there is an immediate reaction. They immediately impose a ban on such a priest. Although according to church canons, if we are not allowed to serve with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, then we should not serve with other churches either, because they, in turn, serve with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So, if we serve with the Poles, for example, the Polish Orthodox Church, or with the Romanians, and they serve with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, then this is also a violation of the canons. Therefore, this is such nonsense, and even a little bit of a clownery, double standards in political church matters. It is a huge accumulation of problems. I do not know when it will be resolved. I have already said this here, and I repeat, this is the indecisiveness of one person who will be responsible for our church, for its degradation, for the decline of our church. After all, today we are massively losing parishes. Due to inactivity, there is a negative situation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the territory of our state. And who is responsible for this? Only one person is responsible, the administrator of the church, the primate of the church, Metropolitan Onufry. Whatever decisiveness or wisdom he shows in this matter, that will be the future of the church. And I want to say once again, I believe that Metropolitan Onufry personally can resolve the issue with the imprisoned priest, Father Kostiantyn, and very quickly. This is my personal conviction. Unfortunately, Father Kostiantyn is not a media person. If he were a media figure, some prominent, high-ranking archimandrite or proto-priest from the Metropolia, he would have been freed long ago and would be in Ukraine, in Kyiv. You see, he is not sufficiently media exposed. He is an ordinary priest, and this is the reason why his issue is not being addressed. This is my opinion. Yes, I am an ordinary person, and this is my view. Perhaps someone will not like it, but this is how it is.
Father, you have spoken painful words. It is truly very painful for us to hear. As believers of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, I sincerely thank all the participants of this difficult conversation.
You know, I would like to add only one thing.
By making statements about persecution of the UOC inside Ukraine, we devalue and, at the same time, demean our brothers and sisters who today, at this very moment, are experiencing real persecution for their faith and convictions. Let me remind you, esteemed audience, of the request to join in prayer and financial support for Father Kostiantyn Maksimov. The card number of his mother will be provided in the program description. Please do not hesitate to check the description and help with any amount. Every hryvnia is important. Our guests on Viche were Father Volodymyr Kovalchuk, a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, volunteer and freelance chaplain. Thank you, Father. And also, invited researcher from Georgetown University, USA, analyst at the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and advisor on investigations of crimes against children as a result of Russian aggression in OSINT for Ukraine, Vladyslav Havrylov. Thank you.
Take care of yourselves, dear friends. Goodbye.